Avery Harper stood in the doorway of the bedroom, leaning against the doorframe, watching as her husband Nick methodically packed his suitcase. He was completely absorbed in the process, carefully folding t-shirts, shaking out jeans, and then casually tossing them on top of his shoes. It all happened with such natural ease, as if he were simply preparing for a routine business trip, rather than leaving his pregnant wife in the final weeks before giving birth. She ran her hand over her rounded belly, as if soothing herself and the baby, and felt a gentle kick from within. Sophia, their daughter, whom Nick seemed to perceive more as an abstract future event than as a living person already present in their lives. "Are you really going to leave?" Her voice sounded softer than she intended, but firm enough. Nick didn't even look up, zipping the suitcase. "Avery, we've already discussed this," he said in a tone that sounded almost condescending. "It's only for a few days. The guys have been planning this for a long time. Tickets are bought, hotel is booked. I promised." Avery looked at him intently. Nick had always been like this, unyielding when it came to his own desires. Going to Vegas with friends was important to him. Being with his wife, who could go into labor at any moment? Not so much. She felt a heaviness in her chest, but it wasn't from anger. It was from a cold, suffocating realization. He didn't even try to understand her anxiety. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't notice her hands trembling as she held onto the doorframe. "Nick, what if I start giving birth?" She took a step forward, trying not to let her voice break. He finally looked at her. "Avery, relax," he smiled, clearly thinking his confidence should reassure her. "You still have at least 2 weeks. In the worst case, if something starts, you have Claire. She'll come right away, you know that. Her sister." Of course, Nick hadn't even thought about being there if something happened. For him, it was a given that someone else would take responsibility for her. Anyone but him. Avery wanted to say something, but suddenly realized that she was tired. Tired of proving the obvious to him. Tired of explaining that she was scared. Tired of waiting for him to change. "Everything will be fine," he repeated, placing the last item, a black leather jacket, in the suitcase. How easy it was for him to say that. Everything will be fine. Those words always sounded like a universal excuse in their marriage when he wanted to avoid a conversation. "For whom?" she asked suddenly, her voice tinged with something new. Bitterness, disappointment, or perhaps realization. Nick frowned. "What?" "Everything will be fine." "For whom?" "For you." He sighed, clearly picking up on the change in her tone. "You're starting again," he grumbled, snapping the suitcase shut. Avery felt her heart tighten. He wasn't even trying to hear her. For him, this wasn't a cause for concern, not a reason to think, not something that could affect his decisions. It was just her starting again. And in that moment, Avery realized what she had probably always known but desperately tried to deny. All these years, he had been selfish. He had been emotionally unavailable. He didn't know how to care for her or their future child. She remembered how in the early days of their relationship, she had closed her eyes to his indifference to her problems, attributing it to his independent nature. She remembered how he always found excuses when she needed support, how he made her feel like she was asking too much, when all she really wanted was basic involvement in their lives. Now looking at him, at his calm, confident face, at his hands gripping the suitcase handle, she understood that she could no longer deceive herself. This man had never been someone who would stay with her in a difficult moment. He was someone who leaves. And the scariest part, he didn't even realize he was doing anything wrong. Avery took a deep breath. "Okay, Nick," she said softly. He raised his eyebrows in surprise, as if he hadn't expected such an easy surrender. "Really?" He smiled cautiously. "See? I told you everything would be fine." She nodded, but inside her, nothing was fine. She watched as he picked up the suitcase, walked out of the bedroom, and past her. She could smell his faint cologne, which she had once grown accustomed to. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said as he left, and the door closed behind him. Avery stood alone in the empty room. Somewhere downstairs her phone vibrated. Probably Claire. She didn't move right away. Instead, She just stood there, looking at the empty shelf where Nick had just taken his things. Her lips trembled, and a moment later, a tear rolled down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of pain. It was a tear of realization. She could no longer deny the truth. And strangely, for the first time in a long time, she felt calm. Avery sat on the edge of the bed, staring into space. The room was silent, broken only by the muffled ticking of the wall clock. Her gaze wandered over the gray-blue wallpaper, the dark wooden furniture, the empty shelf where Nick's things had left a dusty trace. She thought she should feel anger or fear, but there was only an empty, calm stillness. The phone vibrated on the bedside table. She slowly reached out and looked at the screen. "Are you okay?" Those two words, so simple, so ordinary, hit her like a thunderclap. She ran her finger over the screen, rereading the message again and again. "Are you okay?" She could have replied, "Yes." "Lieutenant, pretend that nothing had changed, that Nick was only away for a short time, and that she wasn't scared to be alone." But the words stuck in her throat. She suddenly realized that she couldn't say yes, because it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay that her husband was now in Las Vegas, having fun with friends while she sat in an empty house in her 38th week of pregnancy. It wasn't okay that instead of him, her sister was checking up on her. It wasn't okay that she felt so alone. Her fingers trembled as she typed the reply, "I don't know." As soon as she sent the message, something inside her tightened. She gasped sharply. It was a sensation like a tight band suddenly constricting around her belly. She had felt something similar before, but this time the pain was sharper, deeper. She placed her hand on her belly. "Sophia," she whispered, looking down at her rounded form, hoping it was just a random contraction. But a few seconds later, the pain repeated. Weak but distinct, a contraction. Her heart raced. She grabbed the phone and immediately dialed Nick's number. Ring. Second ring. Third. Voicemail. She tried again, turned off. "No, no, no." Her voice trembled. She looked at the screen, then back at her belly. A feeling of helplessness washed over her like an icy wave. She didn't know how much time had passed, but at some point the phone vibrated in her hand again. "Where are you? What happened?" Before, Avery had never wanted to be a burden to her sister. She had always managed on her own. But now, she could no longer pretend she didn't need help, the one who responds immediately. "Avery, I think I'm having contractions." The response came almost instantly. "Claire, I'm on my way. Don't worry, I'm close." Those words warmed her like a soft blanket in a cold room. She took a deep breath and looked around. Slowly, she made her way to the dresser and pulled open the bottom drawer, where the hospital bag had been packed for several weeks. She knew this moment had to come, but in her imagination, they would pack it together with Nick. They were supposed to joke, worry, and pack things for their daughter together. But now, she stood alone, a bag for her and the baby. She opened it, checking that everything was in place. Clothes for herself, documents, diapers, onesies, a tiny pink hat, the first socks for Sophia. These items, which had once seemed like parts of a happy life, now felt like symbols of a new reality. A reality in which she was the one who cared, made decisions, and took responsibility for their future. Another contraction. She gritted her teeth, clutching her belly. Claire would be here soon. Everything would be okay. But for the first time in a long time, Avery realized a simple truth. Nick was not part of this picture, and perhaps he never would be again. In the hospital room, there was silence, broken only by the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hallway. Avery lay on the sterile white sheets, her body obeying the rhythmic waves of pain. She was alone here. Claire sat beside her, holding her hand, but it wasn't enough to fill the gaping void. Nick hadn't answered. His phone was still turned off, and that could only mean one thing. He had made his choice. She could keep making excuses for him, reminding herself that he didn't know, didn't think that labor would start so soon. But the truth was clear, cold, and undeniable. He wasn't there because he didn't want to be. "Breathe, Avery," Claire reminded her, her voice both gentle and insistent. Avery closed her eyes, clutching the blanket. "Breathe." "Okay, so be it. Inhale, exhale. But with each contraction, not only physical tension came, but also the realization. She was no longer the woman who had said goodbye to her husband that morning, trying to smile. The water hasn't broken yet, but the contractions are getting stronger. I think this will take a few more hours, the nurse said, checking the readings. Avery nodded, but her mind was focused on one thought. What if Nick doesn't come? Claire was saying something about doctors, about how everything would be okay, but her voice sounded like it was coming through cotton wool. Everything in Avery's consciousness had narrowed down to one question. What now? Another contraction hit. She gasped, clutching Claire's hand tightly. You're doing great, Avery. Just a little longer. Claire encouraged her, but Avery barely heard her. All she could think about was the pain and the overwhelming sense of abandonment. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The contractions grew stronger, and Avery felt like she was being torn apart from the inside. She gripped the bed rails, her knuckles white, as another wave of pain washed over her. Almost there, Avery. You can do this. Claire's voice was steady and reassuring. Avery took a deep breath and pushed with all her might. The pain was excruciating, but she knew she had to keep going. One more push, Avery. Come on, you can do it, the doctor urged her. With a final agonizing effort, Avery pushed, and suddenly the pain eased. She heard a cry, a tiny, piercing wail that filled the room. Tears streamed down Avery's face as she looked at her daughter, swaddled in a blanket and placed in her arms. The baby's eyes were closed, her tiny lips pursed, and her little fists clenched. Hello, my little one, Avery whispered, her voice choked with emotion. In that moment, all the pain, fear, and loneliness faded away. All that mattered was the tiny, perfect being in her arms. Congratulations, it's a girl, the doctor said with a warm smile, handing the baby to the nurse. Claire wiped away a tear and smiled at Avery. She's beautiful, Avery, just like her mom, she said softly. Avery looked down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love and protectiveness. She knew that from this moment on, her life would never be the same. She was no longer just Avery. She was a mother. Avery lay in the hospital bed, holding her daughter close to her chest. The world had narrowed down to these quiet moments. Her breath, the tiny fingers clutching the fabric of the hospital gown. The baby had finally settled, her cries subsiding, giving way to soft snuffles. But somewhere deep inside, Avery was still waiting. Waiting for a call, waiting for a message, waiting for Nick. She knew it was pointless, but she couldn't help but give in to the weakness. With her left hand, she reached for the phone lying next to her on the bedside table. The screen lit up. Her heart sank. She quickly scrolled through her thoughts, coming up with possible excuses. Maybe he was still sleeping. Maybe he hadn't heard the calls. Maybe his battery had died. But the voice inside her, the one she had tried to silence for so long, spoke the truth. Claire, who had been sitting in the chair by the window, watching her sister, stood up. Did you text him? She asked softly. Avery nodded slowly, her finger tracing the screen. He didn't even look. Her voice trembled, though she tried to speak calmly. Claire pursed her lips. Try again, she suggested, though it was clear she didn't believe it would make a difference. Avery took a deep breath and hit the call button. Ringing. 1, 2, 3. The subscriber is temporarily unavailable or out of the coverage area. She closed her eyes. That was it. She wouldn't call again. Claire gently took the phone from her hand. He's making his own choices, Avery, she said, but you already know the answer. Avery looked at her daughter. Yes, she whispered. I know. When the nurse came to take the baby for a checkup, Avery was left alone in the room. She lay in the darkness, listening to the hum of the hospital, and felt something inevitable happening inside her. Just a little while ago, she would have been worried, angry, hopeful, but now she no longer needed to hope. Nick Harper didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be part of this family, and perhaps he had never truly wanted to. That thought stung the most, but with the pain came a strange sense of liberation. She no longer had to fight for his attention. She no longer had to wait. She no longer had to convince herself that things would change. Nick had made his choice. Now it was time for her to make hers. Avery woke up to the soft whimper of her daughter lying in the transparent hospital bassinet next to the bed. She immediately knew it wasn't a dream. Her baby was crying, her tiny fists rubbing her face. Her heart ached. Now she was a mother, completely alone. She struggled to sit up, feeling the soreness from the delivery throughout her body. Everything hurt, especially her back and abdomen, but the pain took a back seat. Now her only concern was how to soothe her baby. Dry diaper, warmth, hunger. Avery carefully picked up her daughter, trying to remember what the nurse had said. She brought the baby to her breast, and the little one began to suckle eagerly. She had done it. The initial fear subsided slightly, but with it came another feeling: emptiness. She looked at her phone. No messages from Nick. Claire had called several times asking how she was doing. She said she would come in the morning, bringing clean clothes and food. But tonight she had to get through alone. The clock on the wall showed 3 in the morning. The room was quiet. Only the muffled voices of the night shift nurses could be heard from the hallway. Avery looked at her daughter. She was so small, helpless, completely dependent on her. Once she had thought Nick would be by her side, that they would wake up together at night, learn to swaddle, and find ways to soothe their baby together. But now, it was just her. The warmth of her child pressed against her skin, but inside Avery felt cold. At some point, exhaustion took over. She drifted off to sleep, sitting in bed with her baby in her arms. But a sudden nightmare jolted her awake. In the dream, she saw Nick. He was laughing in a crowded bar, a drink in his hand, surrounded by friends. He was saying to someone, "Yeah, I have a daughter now. So what?" and laughing again. Avery woke up with her heart pounding. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to calm herself. "It's okay," she whispered, more to herself than to her baby. "You're okay. We'll be fine." But the panic didn't subside. She desperately wanted to call someone, to hear a familiar voice. But at 3 in the morning, Claire had already done so much. So she just sat in the darkness, holding her daughter, fighting the overwhelming fear. By morning, her eyes were swollen from crying. She was no longer crying, but inside she still felt like she had been turned inside out. When the nurse came in, Avery asked, "How much longer do I have to stay here?" "The doctor will examine you today, and if everything is okay, you'll be discharged," the nurse replied. "Discharge? Home? To an empty apartment where Hope used to live?" Avery nodded. She could no longer afford to break down. Now she had a daughter, and that little girl deserved better, even if better meant a world without her father. Avery sat in the back seat of the car, holding her daughter close to her chest. Claire was driving, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Avery nodded, though nothing was okay. The sterile hospital walls, the strict routine, the dutiful nurses, all of it had created an illusion of safety. Now she was returning to a place that had once felt like home, but now seemed foreign and empty. When Claire opened the door, Avery saw that the apartment hadn't changed. Everything was in its place. Their photos with Nick on the wall, his jacket tossed on the coat rack. Even the mug he had drunk from before leaving was still in the sink. But now it was no longer their home. "Do you want me to stay?" Claire offered. Avery shook her head. "No, I'll be fine." Claire hesitated but didn't argue. "If you need anything, call me, okay?" Avery nodded and her sister left. Now they were alone. She sank onto the couch, holding her baby in her arms. The silence was deafening, filling every corner of the room. She looked around. The nursery was no longer just a room. It was their world now. She had prepared it weeks ago, and everything was ready. Diapers, onesies, tiny socks. She had imagined this moment so many times. But in her mind, Nick was always by her side. He wasn't there. She sat in the rocking chair and closed her eyes. Everything had changed. Now there would be no one to bring her water in the middle of the night. No one to get up when she was too tired. No one to take the baby and say, "Let me." She was alone. The evening passed in a blur. She fed her baby, changed her, and rocked her to sleep. She moved automatically, as if her body knew what to do, even though her mind was too exhausted to think. But when night fell, the fear returned. She lay in bed, her baby sleeping in the bassinet beside her. The silence was terrifying. With each passing hour, the emptiness inside her grew. She listened to every creak, every sound from outside, and at some point she realized she was waiting for Nick to open the door, waiting for him to call, waiting for everything to turn out to be a misunderstanding, for him to come, see their daughter, and realize that this was more important than anything else. But the phone remained silent. The door didn't open. Avery closed her eyes and tears streamed down her cheeks. She couldn't afford to be weak, but this night was a goodbye to a dream, to illusions, to Nick, to the woman she used to be. Avery returned home with Emily in her arms. The hospital bustle was behind her, but now the real test began, her first day alone with her newborn daughter. The apartment was eerily quiet. Nick hadn't returned, and this no longer surprised her. He hadn't sent a single message or left a note. She carefully placed Emily in the crib. The baby slept peacefully, her tiny fist clenched. At that moment, reality hit Avery harder than it had in the hospital. Nick hadn't held their daughter. He hadn't brought them home. He wasn't there. She sat on the bed and allowed herself a few moments to just breathe. There was an emptiness in her chest, but the tears didn't come. All the pain had already been cried out. Now all that was left was the necessity to move forward. The first few hours at home passed in a whirlwind of tasks. Changing diapers, feeding, soothing. Every movement was an effort through exhaustion. Her body ached from the delivery, and her mind hadn't yet adjusted. But the hardest part was yet to come: loneliness. When Emily fell asleep, the apartment filled with silence again. What used to be comforting now felt oppressive. She looked around. The nursery was no longer just a room. It was their world now. She had prepared it weeks ago, and everything was ready. Diapers, onesies, tiny socks. She had imagined this moment so many times. But in her mind, Nick was always by her side. He wasn't there. She sat in the rocking chair and closed her eyes. Everything had changed. Now there would be no one to bring her water in the middle of the night. No one to get up when she was too tired. No one to take the baby and say, "Let me." She was alone. As evening approached, the phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Claire. "How are you?" she asked softly. Avery sighed. "Surviving. Emily is sleeping. I'm tired, but I'll manage. I'll come over tomorrow," Claire said firmly. "I'll bring food and help with the baby." "Thank you." Avery closed her eyes, feeling a warmth in her chest for the first time that day. Before going to bed, she checked her phone. No messages from Nick, only a notification from social media. Someone had tagged her in a post. With curiosity, she opened it. A photo appeared on the screen. Nick in Las Vegas, surrounded by friends, with a wide smile and a drink in his hand. Avery froze. Inside, she boiled with anger. He hadn't even asked about their daughter. He hadn't called or texted, and yet there he was, enjoying himself as if nothing had happened. Her hands trembled as she was about to close the app, but she noticed the caption under the photo. "Freedom!" Those words hit her harder than anything he could have said. Avery took a deep breath, exhaled, and then deleted the app. He would no longer take up space in her life. She wouldn't allow it. Avery slowly entered the apartment, holding her son in the car seat. The space felt foreign, as if, during her absence, it had lost its familiar warmth. Everything was in its place, but now she saw it differently. Here, she and Nick had once made plans. Here, she had hoped for a happy family life. But now the apartment was empty. The heavy silence filled every corner, and Avery realized that this place now belonged only to her and her son. She placed the car seat on the table and took a deep breath. "Well, little one, welcome home." As she unpacked their things, she noticed how much in the apartment reminded her of Nick. His jacket still hung on the coat rack. His shoes were by the door. She instinctively reached out to put them away but stopped. Why? She had no intention of keeping these things as mementos. Her life was different now. With a decisive motion, she grabbed the jacket and shoes, threw them into a bag, and placed it by the door. Then she stepped back, looked at the result, and felt a strange sensation. Not regret, not pain, but relief. At that moment, her son stirred, and she hurried to him. "Everything will be okay, little one. I promise." The phone rang, shattering the silence. Nick's name flashed on the screen. Avery froze, staring at it. Her heart raced, but not with excitement, with anger and disappointment. She didn't know what to expect. Apologies? Excuses? Or maybe he just wanted to check if she was still alive. For a few seconds she hesitated, then pressed the answer button. "Hello." Her voice was cold. "Avery." Nick's voice was muffled. "How are you? How's the baby?" She scoffed. "You're asking about that only now?" I got confused. It all turned out to be more complicated than I thought. "Was it easy for you to go to Vegas while I was giving birth?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm. Nick fell silent. "I want to see him," he finally said. Avery closed her eyes. She had expected these words but wasn't sure she was ready to hear them. "I'll think about it," she replied calmly. And without waiting for a response, she hung up. Morning began with a faint creak. Avery woke up to her son stirring in his crib. She didn't immediately recognize where she was. Everything still felt unreal. The new life, the new routine, Nick's absence. She sat up in bed, stretched, and looked at her baby. He was sleeping peacefully, his tiny fists clenched. Avery smiled. Despite everything, she had him, and that was enough. But the past wouldn't let her go so easily. By noon there was a knock at the door. Avery frowned. No one was supposed to visit. She cautiously approached the door, looked through the peephole, and froze. Nick. She took a deep breath and opened the door. "Seriously?" Her voice was filled with weariness. He looked worse than usual. Dark circles under his eyes, disheveled hair, a rumpled face. "I called. You didn't answer." He tried to smile, but it looked awkward. "I wasn't sure I wanted to talk to you." He nodded, avoiding her gaze. "Can I see him?" Avery looked at him for a long time, considering. "Come in, but not for long." Nick entered, looking around uncertainly. He seemed to feel like a stranger in what was once his home. Avery led him to the crib. "He's sleeping," she whispered. "Can I?" he asked, reaching out tentatively. She nodded and he carefully picked up the baby. Nick looked at him with something like awe, as if he couldn't believe this child was part of him. "He's so tiny," he murmured. Avery watched him, trying to understand what he was feeling. Was there genuine remorse in his eyes? Or was this just another attempt to ease his guilt? "You knew I was giving birth, Nick," she said softly. He looked down. "I was scared. I thought we had more time. I thought I could, figure things out." She smiled bitterly. "Figure things out? In Vegas?" He didn't respond. He just held his son closer. They were silent for a few minutes. The room was filled only with the steady sound of the baby's breathing. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Nick finally said, "but I want to be his father." Avery looked at him intently. "I don't know if I can trust you." "I'll prove it to you." She nodded but said nothing. When he left, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and the lingering uncertainty, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she felt stronger. Avery sat by the window in her bedroom, watching as the rising sun gently painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. In her hands, she held a cup of tea, savoring the rare moments of silence. In the other room, her little miracle, her son, slept peacefully. 2 weeks had passed since she left the hospital. 2 weeks of trying to adapt to a new reality where there was no room for illusions. Nick had been visiting, sometimes concerned, sometimes determined to fix things. He said the right words, but their meaning felt empty. "He doesn't deserve this family, Shuey," she whispered to herself, sitting in the darkness and rocking her son. Those words felt strange, but true. The night before, he had come again, bringing a toy for his son. He awkwardly held the baby, but he didn't stay long. Work, meetings, fatigue, excuses she had heard throughout their relationship. Yesterday evening he had called again, with a post on social media. Someone had tagged her in a photo of Nick in Las Vegas, surrounded by friends, with a wide smile and a drink in his hand. Avery froze. Inside, she boiled with anger. He hadn't even asked about their son. He hadn't called or texted, and yet there he was, enjoying himself as if nothing had happened. Her hands trembled as she was about to close the app, but she noticed the caption under the photo. Freedom. Those words hit her harder than anything he could have said. Avery took a deep breath, exhaled, and then deleted the app. He would no longer take up space in her life. She wouldn't allow it. Avery remembered everything she had gone through in the past months. The anxious waiting, the loneliness, the betrayal, the disappointment. Everything that had once been hidden behind the facade of a perfect family was now laid bare before her. Claire had been right. She had ignored the signs for too long. At some point, she picked up her phone and typed a message. Nick, let's make an agreement. You can see your son whenever you want, but don't make me any more promises. We both need to move on. She hit send and felt a weight lift off her shoulders. There was no more fear, no more pain. She was choosing herself. Claire dropped by later in the evening, bringing groceries and coffee. You look different today, she noted, sitting down at the kitchen table. Avery smiled, rocking her son in her arms. I just made a decision. What decision? To live my life, without regrets. Claire squeezed her hand. I'm so proud of you. Avery looked at her son, at his tiny fingers clutching her finger. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt confident. This was not a story of loss. This was a story of a new beginning.